Hey, hello, and welcome to Alpha Software's Wednesday webinar. Our usual host, Dave McCormick, is not available today, so as you can see from the screen here, I've just crossed him out and written my own name in red crayon. So I'm your host today, Scott Allen, and I'm excited because today we have joining us, I like to think of him as Alpha Software rock star. Robin Bennett is joining us today. Robin, are you okay with that title?
No, I'm absolutely not. That's terrified me. But never mind, it will do.
Well, I just say that because you do some really cool stuff, and you're wowing us. I think you're sensational. So I think others will agree. Let's see what you've got to share with us today. I'm going to make you the presenter. Let me just, and there you go. You should be presenting, and
Yeah. So you should be able to see a slide now.
yep, everything's there, looking good.
Cool. Well, this one's a bit different, Scott. So Dave's very good to me when we do these together because he always asks questions and makes me laugh. So no pressure on you. If you can talk to me as we're going along, that would be great.
I'll do my best. I can't promise the humor, but I'll try.
Okay, so this one is a little bit different to the webinars that I've been running with Dave every month. This one's come out of some training that we've been doing for some new developers, some developers that are brand new to coding, but also some developers that are coming across from other platforms. And I realized there's many ways of showing lists of data from SQL tables in Alpha, editable lists, and this is a real building block of pretty much every application that you'll be building. You'll want to show data from SQL tables, you want it to be editable, but there are several ways of doing it in Alpha. Like many things in Alpha, Scott, there's lots of ways of doing things, not just the one. So I'm going to run through some of those techniques. I'm going to show you how fast you can do them when you know what you're doing, and it's pretty incredible what Alpha's able to do in that regard. But I'm also going to show you some interesting real-world examples as we go along, and more specifically, Scott, to try and get people to stay to the end of the webinar, I've got some interesting screens at the end which don't necessarily look like the way that we've actually built them. I won't say any more than that, but there's a little bit of fun at the end just to finish off.
A little teaser.
Okay, a little teaser, yeah, just to keep people interested. For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Robin. I'm the director here at Start Software. We build bespoke applications. We build software as a service applications. We build apps for the app stores. We do troubleshooting on Alpha projects. We do consultancy. Generally speaking, we love working in Alpha. There's 15 of us around the world. We're based mainly in the UK, but we also have a sister company in Australia. We've got developers in Indonesia and also in the US. So if you've got a problem with a project, I know Alpha, you've got your own professional services division. So if Alpha can't help, give us a call. My email address is at the bottom of the slide there. So lots and lots and lots of lists. That's what we're going to look at today. We're going to start off with something proper old school. Grids are the, I used to say to Selwyn, grids are the future, and he'd look at me like I was mad. But actually, they're still useful. Let me show you one, a real one, and all the things I'm going to show you today are live. So keep your fingers and toes crossed, if you would. Let me just get my thing out of the way. There we go. So if I show you, this is Alpha Tracker, by the way. This is one of our software as a service systems. Here is a grid. It's a list of data from a SQL view, actually, in this case, not a table. And you can sort by the column headings. And if you've used Alpha before, none of this will be a surprise to you, but you may be new to Alpha today, so you may be wondering what it's all about. So you can sort, you can export to Excel, and at the top here, I've got a search part. So this is a grid. This is typically what they look like. We've got a few things in here that you might not have used before. So we've got some company logos here for the companies in question showing. We've got some imagery showing. We've got hyperlinks. We've got a row expander, it's called, so I can expand that and see some more information. We've got folders that link through to documents. So it's quite a functional grid, but it is actually just a grid. I'll just take a little aside here, have you noticed these buttons at the top here, Scott? This is our favorites bar, which users really enjoy. And we've also got the sort of universal search thing going on at the top here above our menu. This is a tabbed UI menu, and Dave's been covering those in the last couple of weeks. In fact, I think last week he showed how to convert this into a more mobile-friendly style of menu. But we've got this universal search, which we love. So I typed in I pressed project list there. I could have typed in project list and got the same sort of options here, and I could have got to it that way. So if you're into the tabbed UI, have a look at the favorites bar, have a look at the universal search, the menu search. Really good things. So this is a grid. How did we build it and what's a grid for? If I go back to my slide for a moment and just talk about them in general, then I'll actually build one and show you how fast they are. First things to say is it's online only. So grids are online only. You can't work offline on a grid. So you've got to be connected to your database and so have a connection through. They're very stable. Now, because they have been in the alpha product for a long time, they're very stable. They don't go wrong, but we don't see many new features in them. But that can be a good thing because they're really, really stable. So you can put these in your applications knowing that they're going to work quickly and they're going to be very reliable. Only really good for desktop apps because they're not responsive. Showing their age, I guess, in that respect, Scott, but there's still, a lot of applications, back office applications are primarily used on laptops or desktops, so still worth a look and very, very, very quick to build. Let's show you how we do that. Can you see my alpha okay there, Scott?
I can. It looks good. Yep.
Perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do all of this live. The first thing we're going to do is, if I delete that, is I'm going to create us a database to work with. Now, when you're training people or you're experimenting, or for that matter, if you're sending a test case through to alpha because you think you might have found a bug or you want a new feature, this is the way to do it. If you go into your connection strings, which is where you connect through to a database, and click this blue hyperlink here where it says create the demo one, use SQLite, and then because I've already got several I've created, it's asking if I want a clean copy or one I've used before. I'm going to make a clean one, and that's just created a SQLite database on my laptop based on the Microsoft Northwind database, and it's really handy for training, for sharing with people, like I say, for sending for you guys at alpha, because it's something that we can all create and access really easily. So once I've done that, I then can create my grid component. It is a component in itself. So if I choose web component here, you'll see it listed as a type of component that I can create, just as I could create a UX or indeed a tabbed UI or many other types, but it's a type of component. I then need to choose one of 5 different styles of grid. Now for this webinar today, I'm going to choose an updatable grid because that's what I'm talking about. So lists of records that are updatable, but there are 4 other types that you can look at. Gives me a bit of helpful information here, and then I need to start filling in the boxes that's presented. So the first one is, what database am I connecting to? Well, I've only got the one database that I just created there. So I connect, then I tell it the table I'm connecting to or the view. So I'm going to use the customers table. I then go here onto the left-hand side into the field section, and I say which fields I want in my grid. So I'll pick the first 5. And then that will do. That will actually get me working grid. So I can click on working preview, and there we go. And that's an editable grid connected to the database. I can type in changes. I could save them, or I could save them all with a button at the bottom. There's a submit button down there. Easy as that. Now, the one I just showed you before had got a search area. So let's see how we switch that on. Not completely intuitive, this, I wouldn't say, because you can't actually switch it on from a property until you've gone back to the component type and enabled the search part here. So that's just something you have to remember how to do. Once you've done that, it then gives you this extra section on the left-hand side. You've got the search part, you can then add fields. So if I add the company name and the contact name, for example, go back into working preview, we'll see we've got search available now. So I can search for Berg, I think is one of the companies. And sure enough, that's going to give me the record that I want. Now that's really functional, and you can see how fast that was to do. I can create grids in my sleep in approximately 14.3 seconds. They're that fast to put together. They work quickly. You need that online connection, and you can style them up as much as you want, as you saw before with the one I showed you. So if I just put that back on, this starts with the search closed. When you open the search, it's animated. The fields are horizontal, not vertical. We've got graphics on here. You know, it's styled quite heavily, so you can, you know, go to town on a grid. This is the standard look that comes sort of out of the box, but that's a grid. Lots of benefits. The big disadvantages, Scott, are not really mobile friendly, and you have to be connected to the database. So you need a connection. You can't work offline with a grid, but that's a grid.
Yeah.
I forgot to say, we welcome questions, don't we, on these webinars? So if people want to ask a question at any time, if they put a note in the Q&A box, Scott will see it. He'll interrupt me, and I'll do my best to answer it.
That's right.
So that's a grid. If I go back to my slide and have a look at what we're going to cover off next, we're now going to look at something much more recently added into the Alpha platform, and that's a list control. Now, list control is not a component in itself. It's a control that you add to a UX component. A UX component is the workhorse of an Alpha built application. It's a general purpose, do everything, user interface canvas that you can put controls on, and a list control is just one of the controls that you can add to a UX component. The end result, you'll see in a minute, will look eerily similar to a grid because of the way I'm going to build it, but there's lots of differences behind the scenes. The first one is that it can work disconnected. You don't have to have that live connection through to the database. That means it's good for mobile. That means you can build applications that work offline. Secondly, it's responsive. It's responsive, so that means it's really good for handheld devices as well as laptops and desktops. We use lists all the time now in desktop applications, and we just build them so that if somebody's using the application on a phone or a tablet, then the list automatically responds to the smaller screen size and is still usable. They're very fast, but you do have to think about how much data is being pulled back to a list. Now, this is a big difference with a grid. Grids are inherently paginated. In other words, they only call from the database the first 10 records or 25 records or 50 records or 100 records, however many records you're showing on each page of data. So they're efficient and they don't slow down even if you have lots of data in your database table. With a list, because it's trying to pull the data down so that you can work offline, you do have to try a little bit harder to make it efficient if you have lots of records in the table. And if we've got time today, I'll show you how to do that. They're very flexible, and as I mentioned before, they're responsive. So let's have a look at a real list example. Now, I've got in this application, back in Alpha Tracker, I've got something called the weekly timesheet. Now, this is a screen that's used by staff to input their time that they're working on jobs during the week. Would you call them timesheets in the US, Scott? Have you got another name for them?
What's that? No, timesheets. We call them that. Yeah.
Timesheets, yeah, same thing. So yeah. Here I've actually got two lists in one UX. So here's a list at the top. These are the days and times that I've worked, and I can add a new row and show you how that works. So I can say, oh yeah, on that job on Monday I did 7 hours of work, and I can save that. And at the bottom I've got a list which is summarizing the work for the week. So I just put that in there, and you can see it's added it to 7 hours here under the Monday column. So this is like a summary day by day by day by day for the week, and these are the detailed records above. So the list at the bottom isn't actually editable. It's just showing me data from a SQL view. The list at the top is editable. As you saw, I just click on the values to edit them, and that's feeding this view at the bottom. Does that make sense, Scott?
I think so.
Good.
Yeah.
So let's look at how we put a list together. So as I mentioned, a list is a control, not a component. So I need a UX component to drop the list on. So I'm just going to do a blank UX. Won't pick any of the templates on offer. So here's my blank canvas. I'm going to add a control, which is the list control. And I just want one of them. And this button here is genius. If you're new to Alpha or inexperienced with lists, use this button. This is a lifesaver because lists over the last 3 or 4 years have grown in flexibility and complexity as you added extra features hit there at the Alpha team. And it can be a little bit overwhelming with a list, I think, to start from scratch. But using this quick setup genie, it's so simple. So I go into the quick setup genie. I pick a connection string, and I'm just answering the questions top to bottom. I choose the table. I'll go with customers again, because that's the one we just used on the grid. We need some fields, so I'm going to choose some fields from here. I'm not going to set a filter or an order. I'll just have all of the records. There aren't too many records in this customer table. We'll have a search part because we put one into our grid. And I'll say we want to search company name and contact name. Click OK, and that will put all of the necessary controls into the UX for me. So here's our list control, but it's also added a few controls to make the search work. And if I work in preview on this, we'll see we've got a very similar looking display to the grid. So here's our list of data, and it's searchable because if I think I looked for Berg before, didn't I? So if I look for Berg, sure enough, there's our Berg record. So some similarities without us having to do anything, including, for example, that the headings are sorting, they're sort headings. So if I clear the filter and go back, you can see that's sortable. Now you'll notice at the moment, this isn't editable. I'm clicking on the row, but I can't actually edit the data. And I did say we'd be building editable lists. And that's just a property of the list. So if I double click the list, go into the properties of the list, and if I just search for edit, I've got an option here to allow in-place editing. I tick that, click OK. It just came up with a little message there. It's going to change another setting for me, which is very helpful. Go back into working preview, and sure enough, now we've got the same display, but if I click on a row, I can now edit this row. So I could be changing the data here, and that's actually 58, for example. Now, the other thing you might notice, if I scroll down the screen, in fact, I haven't got it yet because I've not put the buttons on. I'll put some extra buttons on in a sec. We'll notice in a minute, when I put on the, I'm going to put a detail view on, which is another way of editing the records. We'll see we don't get one save button, we sort of get two. And I'll show you that now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all of these controls from my UX, so I'm back starting from scratch. I'll add the list back on again, use my quick setup genie again. This time I'm going to fill out exactly the same as what I did before. So I'm going to pick the customers table and pick some fields to go on it. This time I won't bother with the search part, we've seen how to do that, but I will put on a detail view, and let me show you this. So a detail view is going to give us a simple form display for the data that's in the list. Now I'm going to say I'll leave all of these as default, Scott. So it's all the fields in the list. Do I want some buttons? Yeah. Do I want a place for the area? Yeah, sounds fine. So click OK. Let's see what happens now. So now we have a list control, but we also have the extra controls it's added on for my detail view. And if we look at this, we'll see we've got the list at the top of the screen. Here we go. And at the bottom, we've got the detail view, as I mentioned. So if I pick the chop suey Chinese and we change the number here from 29 to 30, you'll see I've got a save button, but I've also got a synchronize button. And this is where the key difference between a list and a grid comes into play. So with a grid, as soon as I make a save, well, as soon as I press save, it's actually issuing the SQL behind the scenes to update the table. But with a list, because it can work offline, the save, in this case from a detailed view, is actually changing the data here in the list, but not necessarily immediately syncing it back to the database. And I'd have to press the synchronize button for those updates to go back to the database and for Alpha to issue the necessary SQL updates in this case to reflect the changes in the SQL database itself. Now you can in code and with some options actually in the list combine these two operations so that the save would actually do a save and sync. But the reason they're separate is so that you can work without having that live connection through to the database. In fact, again, if I drop all the controls and do that process again, if you're watching this back, by the way, on YouTube, you can pause and sort of repeat these things yourself. Just make sure you create the same connection string and sample database, that Northwind one that I showed you at the beginning. So quick setup again this time, and I'll just repeat this process for the third time. It's so fast, it's so easy to do, as you can see. Pick some of the fields, and this time I'll have the detailed view as we did before, but I've got this option here, Scott, to persist the data to local storage. And this is where you can really go to town with a disconnected mobile application. So it's a different concept from a grid. The grid is showing you some records, but as soon as you press save or submit, the records are going back to the database immediately. With a list control, they're not. The data is staying in your browser or in your local file system or in IndexedDB or somewhere that's offline, but when you sync, it then pushes those records back to the database. And by exploring this disconnected operation feature, you can then start to think about apps and how apps work, because you can use an app even if you're offline, generally speaking. But it's a different way of thinking. You've got to be aware of that when you're putting it together. Now, because it's a control, not a component, that gives us lots of flexibility. For example, I could add another list into this same UX. That would be something we do a lot. In the weekly timesheet one I just showed you had one list above the other. So this is how you do that. You'd have like a list control and another list control. You could wrap the lists in containers, you could wrap them in frames, you could put them in panel cards to build that mobile-friendly application. So very different from a grid. A grid is a component in its own right. A list is a control on a UX component. Very useful, as you'll see in a minute when we look at some other real world examples. As I mentioned from the outset there, I've created the same list essentially 3 times. All 3 times I use that quick setup genie because that's the way to make it easy if you're connecting to a SQL data source. Another big difference between lists and grids is that lists can connect to different types of data. They can connect to static data, so you can present a list of information that you don't want people to change. They can connect through to transform data, connect through to JSON data, all sorts of things, not just SQL databases. So that's another big difference between grids and lists. We use lists a lot now in desktop applications, where previously 5 years ago we would have used grids. We still do use grids though. So it's, grids are not resigned to the sort of the waste heap. They're definitely part of our build process still, but we do use lists an awful lot now instead.
Indeed. Are you ready to answer a few questions by chance?
I am. Oh yeah, please. Yeah, fire away.
Okay, well, great. One of them was in particular, you touched on briefly, there was some curiosity as to how to combine those save and sync control that you had mentioned can be done. What is the process in doing that?
Right, so we can hook into some of the events to do that. So lists have got a really comprehensive set of events. Now, events in Alpha are like events in every development platform. So they're things that happen that you can then attach code or or trigger something else to happen from. So in the lists themselves, we have the lists events down here, and there are lots and lots and lots of events that fire. So what you can say is, after we've saved the record, call the synchronize method essentially. So we can just say, when one thing happens, make the next thing happen. That way we could get rid of the synchronize button. We would literally just delete the synchronize button because it wouldn't be needed. And then as soon as you saved a record, Scott, the synchronized process would happen. That's one way of doing it. So you can hook into events. There are other ways of doing it as well, but that's the way we tend to do it. Sometimes even in desktop applications though, it's quite nice to keep them separate. The reason for that is performance. If I just bring this one up, this is one I just put together earlier when I was checking out how I was going to show the webinar today. If you think about it, if you're editing lots of data on one screen, like oftentimes you are, you don't want to save as you're going along. You want to sort of be typing as fast as you possibly can. When you want something to be quick in a web application, you don't want to be issuing instructions back to a server. Even if the server's a fast server, you're still going round the loop from your machine back to a server across the internet, and there's bound to be a delay. So sometimes, Scott, what we do is we allow people to make updates to the data in the list. That will be instantaneous because it's all client side, it's all in the browser. There's no communication with the server. And then we put a big save button or submit button, which actually then does that synchronize, and all of the updates go back in one go.
Right.
For users that are, for example, on the phone taking orders from customers, that can be a godsend because they can type in all the information they need in one go without any interaction with the server at all. Then they press the button once and all of the data goes back to the server in that list sync. So it can be a really good, having the two processes as separate can actually be a really good thing for performance.
Brilliant, makes sense. We did have another question too. It was more about time date management and validation, and I don't know if you've encountered this or had to do it where you need a date range and there's a date field 1 and then date field 2. Date field 2 will always have to be after any date after date field 1, right? Like let's say you're picking out days that you're going to go on a vacation, and date 1 is August 1st. You know that date 2 can't be anything before August 1st. So how do you validate that and make sure that any date comes and date 2 comes after?
I'll give you the short answer, and then okay. Shall we leave this as a present for Dave when he gets back? How about that?
We could definitely anything that goes over beyond our time or abilities at the moment. We can just do another time.
The short answer to the question is, if you've got a detail view in a list. So this is a list with that detail view that I showed. The controls in the detail view are just normal alpha controls. In this case, they're all text boxes, but they could be drop-down boxes, radio buttons. They could be text boxes, which are configured to be date time pickers. You've got access to all of the normal alpha validation features. So we've got immediate validation. We can do client side, which can compare two fields in the browser. You can do validation server side using server side X basic. You could hook into the focus events, which is all the blur events, which is when you lose focus from a box. So as you tab out of the box, you can run some X basic, or you could run some JavaScript to do it. So there's lots and lots and lots of methods. If you use a detail view, then all of the controls are normal alpha controls. So all of the normal alpha methods are there to enable you to do the validation. I say if you use a detail view with controls because there are other ways, in fact, of doing the detail view in a list which don't involve you creating lots of controls, including using those JSON forms that Selwyn showed about 6 weeks ago, possibly a month ago. And I showed off in my last webinar as well. JSON forms are the future. They're amazingly powerful. So if you've not seen the JSON form webinars, look those up in the Alpha Anywhere Q&A webcast channel on YouTube. Well worth a look. And if you use the JSON forms, you end up with far fewer controls in your UX, which means the UX performs better as well. So lots of advantages for the to do the detail view in a different way. I just did it the sort of the easiest way to show there in a demo, but there are other ways of doing the same thing. So we've covered off 2 of the types now, 2 of the 3 I wanted to go over.
Before you
The
leave
third one,
list control, one last thing about the list.
oh yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah, sorry. So if you have information that has been saved but not synced, can those
Yeah,
edits be lost? Is there some way that you could do something that would make those be lost from the cache or any sort of
yeah,
memory that it's in at the moment? How about that?
yeah. So lost accidentally, I guess the question means, yeah, could you accidentally lose what you'd typed? Yes, if you don't click the disconnected operation checkbox, the one that I showed that's at the bottom of the quick setup genie, if you don't check that, the data lives in your browser, but it only lives in your browser. So if you close your browser and reopen, you've just lost all of your edits. If you have the disconnected operation checked, then it's going to ask you where you want to store that data in your sort of client side. So it will store it. You've got lots of choices now, Scott. You can store it in the browser sort of memory. You can store it in the file system, so you can have a file with the information in it. You can store it in this thing called IndexedDB, which is another client-side thing. If you do those, it will persist. In other words, if you close the app, I'm imagining in this case somebody's working in an app, then reload the app, the data will still be there because it lives independently of the app. So yeah, if you're thinking about working in an environment where somebody could accidentally close the app or whatever without pressing the sync button, use that disconnected operation, the persisted data it's called, and then there's a copy of the data locally on your device. It doesn't matter if you close without syncing, it will be there next time you come back in.
Brilliant, thank you.
No problem. Right, last one then, the last technique I'm going to show you is something called repeating sections. Now these are only used in a very specific situation, but anybody watching the webinar that's been working in business systems for more than a few months will have come across this situation. It's really common, and it's the situation where you've got a parent-child relationship on the screen. Classically, typically it's an order, so in an order header, order detail, or an invoice. So you've got the invoice header, invoice detail. So that's the rows on the invoice or the rows on the order. Let me show you a real one. Again, in our Alpha Tracker application, it's convenient Alpha Tracker because it's got all of the techniques in, which is really handy for me. So if I look at our invoicing screen in Alpha Tracker, so I've got a nice little pipeline at the top here that's showing me all of the projects ready to invoice and all of the ones that have got draft invoices and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if I go to the exported invoices, this is a list of invoices here on the screen with pounds in this column here. If I bring up this screen, this is a UX that's using repeating sections. So here's my invoice header information. So this is all about the invoice and who it's going to and how many days they've got to pay. And here I've got the rows of data that's on the invoice itself, the invoice lines. And this is done with a repeating section. Now, repeating sections are only applicable to that scenario. They're not applicable as general purpose screens, but it's such a common scenario that Alpha have very kindly put us together a method for doing these screens. A couple of caveats here, Scott, which are really important. The first one is it's only applicable if there's a parent-child relationship. You can do parent-child, child-child, by the way. You can keep going. It can be, as long as it's hierarchical, it's fine. But the big caveat here is that it doesn't work well if there are hundreds and hundreds or thousands and thousands of rows to show in the data. So when you're talking to your client or thinking about building this, ask the question, how many rows do you normally get on an order? How many lines do you normally get on an order? How many lines do you get on an invoice? If the answer is, well, normally no more than 10 or 20, fine. If you're working for an organization who has orders or invoices with thousands of lines on, you might not use this technique, and I'll explain why in a minute if that's okay. Let me show you how you build them. This is the most complicated. I left it till last, but hopefully if I run through it reasonably slowly, then we'll see what's going on. So repeating sections are something you put on a UX. So I need a UX component. I'll start off with a blank one. And firstly, I'm going to put the controls in place for the header part, and we're going to use the order table and the order detail table in the Northwind database, which is the one we've been using so far. So add control. I will put them all on as text boxes for the moment. There could be different types, but I'm just going to do it for text boxes for the purposes of the demo. And I can use this feature here where I can add multiple in one go. And this hyperlink at the bottom, populate list from a table, is a real time saver. If I click that one, again, click our connection string. This time I'm going with the orders table. This is for the header information. I don't want all fields, so I'm going to ask for just a selection. And I'm going to leave these 4 checkboxes selected at the bottom, which is going to give me a standard set of behavior that I would want for a UX that's connected to a database. Now, this is called a data bound UX now. It's data bound because Alpha's just added some properties and some code for me that means this UX is connected to the database. I've only connected it to the header so far, but I can show you it working. If I just go into working preview, you'll see we've got the fields that I asked for from the order header table, and I can move through them, look with these navigation buttons, and I've got a new record button, a delete record button, a submit and a reset. And in fact, this is all now editable. So if I change the customer ID, you can see the submit buttons enabled now, and I could actually save that change back to the database. Okay, so far, Scott? Yeah.
Indeed.
Right, now we need to get the detail lines on, the order detail lines. So how am I going to do that? Well, let me show you how I do that one. I think I'll put them here, actually, right underneath the order header. I'm going to use the same technique. I'm going to add control, choose text box, and leave it set at creating multiple controls at once. Again, I'll use the same technique with this hyperlink, populate list here. Again, I'll choose the connection string, and this time it's the order details table. But what I'm going to do though is I'm going to unselect this information at the bottom. That's because I can't actually do the detail using this little trick. This little trick doesn't work if I try and do it all in the one go. So I'm just going to use this technique to give me the fields. If I press OK here, I'm going to get an error message, and I'll explain why. The error message is telling me that this control or this field is there's already one on the UX called the same thing, and sure enough there is, because order ID is the field name for the header order ID as well. So I'll rename that here just so it's unique. That should add me the controls. There they are. Now that will have put some controls on the screen, but it won't actually have, it doesn't know that it's got to be repeated. We've not told it anything about repeating it yet, but I do have some extra fields here. They look pretty ugly because they're in the wrong place, and they're also one above each other, not on the same row. So let's fix that. So I select all of those, and I take off the new line character off the end. That will put them all on the same row. And it's asking me about data binding because it's wondering whether I want to update the code automatically, which is what I've said I wanted to do. So I've now, still looking pretty ugly, but at least I've got them on the same row. Now we need to select the repeat to set that. So I highlight the fields I want to repeat, and I add a container around them, because the repeating section is actually a special type of container. And here it is, it's the first one down in the list, repeating section. And that now will give me multiple copies of the order lines. Here we go. Okay, we're starting to look more like the screen I showed you at the beginning. A couple of things we need to change. I'll move that reset button above the section because that's in the wrong place. So I've now got submit and reset above the section. But the next thing I'm going to do is I've got to tell it how to connect this repeating section back to the database itself, and I do it through this data binding option on the left hand side of UX. I go into data binding, and I need to go into this second option to bind the controls to fields in one or more tables. Firstly, I need to specify the tables. Well, it knows about the orders table already. That's because I use that little trick to add the fields from the order table with all of the buttons. But I need to add in the order details table, and it will then show, okay, orders is connected to order details, but I need to tell it how to link. That's what these are for here. So it's order ID goes to order ID. So far, so good. Telling me there that because the code's been written for me, I've just got to refresh the code in a minute. That's fine. Then I need to say what's connected to what. Well, the top level is already connected to orders. Alpha did that for me, but it needs to know that the repeating section is linked to order details. If you had multi-level here, so you had another level beneath it, you would just have multiple things here, Scott, to select. So it's nice and easy. And then finally, it wants to know how all of the controls on the UX are linked to the fields in the table. Now, the top level, it's done it for me. It did it for me as part of that little genie that added all the fields in the first place. But the second one, it doesn't actually know. Now, I can select it. You can see it doesn't know what they're connected to, but I can automatically map them, which it's done. The only one it can't automatically map is the one that I had to change the name of. So on this one, I need to just say, yeah, this actually links back to the order ID field in the order details table. And now I've done that, I click OK, and sure enough, this will do what we expected it to do, which is show me each order and the lines there associated with the order. And now if I flick through, you'll see that the lines change as the order changes at the top. And this is all updated. Yeah, this is all updatable. So we've built the structure. It wasn't difficult to do, but it's something that if you haven't done it, if you don't do it regularly, you need to just look on the internet. Or actually, this was fun. I asked ChatGPT if I could do this, if it could explain how to do it, and it did. It told me how to do it. So
wow.
I did a webinar with Dave the other week on AI, which was really fun. And because I couldn't remember how to do repeating sections myself, I actually asked ChatGPT and it told me. I can probably show you that here. There we go. So I asked ChatGPT the question: describe the steps I'd like to take to create a UX with a repeating section to list the rows from a table called blah 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 blah. And there we go. It tells us how to do it. So even ChatGPT can help if you're stuck with doing a repeating section.
Wow. There you go.
Yeah. Cool, eh? Really cool. And now what I'd do is I'd obviously style it up. I'd make it work as I want to, but that's essentially it. So coming back to my slide, just as the reminder, it's only in the situation where you've got this parent-child relationship. So orders, invoices, it's that scenario, really common in virtually every database application that's ever been built. You've got that scenario, and that's where you want to look at repeating sections. If though, and I need to say this again, just so everyone's heard me say it out loud, if typically this screen is going to have 1,000 rows of data on it, think again, because repeating sections generate lots of HTML that goes to the browser, and they do slow down if you have lots and lots and lots of lines. In those situations, Scott, you can do the same thing with a list. So you can actually put a list, which would be the rows of data on your UX, and that will perform much better.
Yeah.
But repeating sections are still pretty cool. Any questions at that point, Scott? Otherwise, I'll show you some interesting real-world examples.
Yeah, the other question that I had was more questions about your project management tool that you were using earlier. And they said Start Software looks very polished and complex, and I'm assuming that Start Software is the name of your company, but I think they meant your project management tool.
The actual Alpha Tracker.
The Alpha Tracker, yes. And they were curious about the hardware specs and number of Alpha servers, and if you had any concurrent user limits.
Oh, okay. So Alpha Tracker is a product that we sell to a particular industry. So it's a software as a service type product. It handles business from initial contact with a customer, sales, through projects, through diary, through doing stuff on site, through to generating invoices. So it's like a business management product for a particular sector. But we have fun with this, Scott, because we actually use it ourselves to run our own business. So I think is the phrase eating your own dog food? I think, is it dog food manufacturers that give the dog food to people to take home? I think the employees, something like that.
Yeah.
So we use our own software to run our own business, and that way, if there's things in the software that annoy us, that annoy our clients, it annoys us, and we fix them. So yeah, so that's what Alpha Tracker is. It's one of our sort of key products that we've built. It's been around for a long time now, actually. I think we've probably been selling Alpha Tracker for about 10 years, perhaps a bit more.
That's
we're
cool.
on release 39. If you want to know more about Alpha Tracker, if you're just interested, then have a look at our website, which is alpha-tracker.co.uk. This is some of our development team on an unusually sunny day in the UK. We don't get days like that very often.
Aren't you getting more of them lately, though?
Yeah, we do. Yeah,
Global
we're getting
warming
far too many now with global warming.
Yeah.
And we run a blog to say what's going on. So there we go. It's a bit about Alpha Tracker if you're interested. So final couple of minutes, Scott, on the webinar, just to show you what some grids and things that you might, and lists and repeating sections that might not look like them. This one, so I've called them odd bods. That's a sort of a UK term for strange things. This is a grid. It's in Alpha Tracker actually, but it may not look like one because of this pipeline effect that we've done here. And this is done by injecting HTML into each row as the grid is rendered. The grids have got a really cool feature where you can hook in XBasic, and as each row is rendered, you can generate HTML and inject it. And that's what we're doing here. So this is just HTML. So this is showing for each project the state, what milestones have been checked off, and that's injected HTML into a grid. So you can sort of really go to town with a grid. Very useful feature. This is a grid, and grids, each sort of square or each sort of rectangle in this. These are nuclear power stations in the UK. It's all just demo data, but I put this together for a demo I was doing. So these are nuclear power stations, and each one is essentially a row in a SQL view. And ordinarily we present them, one on top of the other. But the grids have got a facility where you can present them in an actual grid. So you can say how many columns and rows you want. So we've done that, and we've also included an image, and we've also included a Google Map object and some buttons that are styled to look like icons that do things as well. So this, in fact, is a grid. So quite a flexible use of a grid there. This is a grid. Grids have got a really cool feature where you can display data on a map. And it's just one checkbox. You can just say, yeah, I want the data in this grid to be displayed as a map instead. So we've got lots of maps in Alpha Tracker and other products that are actually grids behind the scenes, just with a checkbox to say display them as a map. It's a bit harder than it used to be because Google now require to put like a license key and an API key, and quite reasonably they want us to pay for their mapping features, but it's still doable with in Alpha. This is a fun one. Can you spot the list in there, Scott?
Can I spot the what?
The list. There's a list on that screen. Can you spot it?
Is it the buttons up at the top?
Yeah, it's the doctor. These are all physicians. And how late or early they're running. So Dr. Hampton's running 40 minutes late. That's Dr. Fisher running 30 minutes late. Dr. Olson's 10 minutes late. Dr. Gaines is 15 minutes ahead of schedule. So this bar at the top here, this is a product called On Time Care that we've built for a US-based software company. This bar at the top showing the status of all the physicians, that's actually a list. So it's a list that's heavily styled and presented horizontally, not vertically. So it's actually a horizontal styled list, but it is just a list. Josh, one of our developers in the US, he put that together for us and did a fabulous job. This is also a list. So this is these are rooms in a healthcare setting, so in a clinic or a hospital. The waiting room, the exam room 1, exam room 2, etc. And this is showing which patients and which physicians and staff are in each room and what the status of each room is. This is also a list. Again, this is presented in sort of rows and columns, not one on top of the other, or for that matter, next to each other in a horizontal display. But it's just a heavily styled list, and it's very, very cool. On Time Care, this product is full of really clever cleverly styled lists, and they work really, really well. Josh did a great job for us.
Yeah, I know you kind of surprised us when you presented that the first time. We're like, oh wow, this is some advanced usage of our tools, and we really liked it.
Yeah, I think we showed it at DevCon once, or perhaps it was a webinar, I can't remember. But yeah, we
There's a
show this one off
webinar
to
on YouTube of it. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's very, very cool. This, I think I've only got one or two left. Yeah, one or two left. This one is a product called Legacy Legal, which is one of the best looking systems that we've ever built. It's stunningly good. And I'm not bragging there because we didn't do the design. A design house did the design and gave it to us. So they gave us the CSS and the graphics and the, you know, all of the color information. But it's so professional. It's fabulous. We love Legacy Legal. So we built the software in alpha. They did the styling and gave us the material to style with. But this here, this is a list of recommendations. That's a repeating section. I guess we could have done it as a list. We probably even could have done it as a grid, but it's actually repeating sections. This is a list of products that have been recommended to a client. And then this one here is also a repeating section. This is where somebody's completing quite a complex form about how many houses you own, because this is all about planning for your future and financial planning and things. And each one of, I struggle to do a screenshot, but each house has its own repeating section with lots of show hide. So depending on the value of the house or certain aspects of the house, it props up extra questions. But this is actually section works really well because people, you know, most people don't have thousands of houses. And I mentioned there's this sort of restriction on how many rows you can show and have it still perform well. Most people only have 1 or 2 or 3 houses or whatever, you know, depending. But you know, you don't have hundreds or thousands of houses, so it's a really good use for this. And because in a repeating section you've got access to all of the normal alpha styling tools and all of the controls and all the rest, you know, you can really go to town. But this is you know, a beautiful looking application. This is fabulous. This is our team leader Dan's work. He's built the application. It runs very fast, heavily styled, like I say, styled by a styling agency. But that's a really nice repeating section, and it's lovely to see a repeating section that's not an order or an invoice, Scott, because they are so boring. We do them all the time. So this is a slightly different one. So that's it. I think that's all I wanted to run through today. I've gone on a bit longer than I thought, but I hope that was useful and understandable. Good if you're new to alpha, because that gives you some ideas of some of the techniques that are available in alpha. But if you're familiar with alpha, maybe you've picked up something along the way there, or even just you know, nice to see some real world examples of different techniques that you can use to present data from SQL tables and views.
Absolutely. Hey, and speaking of questions, you know, we've gotten some great questions that we've fed you along the way. I have a question, and that is, you know, it's like, I'm always impressed with what you do with existing alpha technologies. You know, it seems like Start Software, you've got a great set of developers that are working with you, and you guys push our products into uses that maybe others hadn't thought of before, and that's that creativity helps us as developers, I think. And you know, I kind of wonder about some of the newer tools that Alpha is coming out with. How are you finding that you're able to integrate some of these newer things? You mentioned the JSON changes, additions that we've had, things like Form View and ViewBox, some of these newer controls. Like, when those controls come out, how do you guys assess them, and how do you guys consider using them into your products in the future?
Yeah, really good question. So I think this is where I show my age, actually, because the younger guys, the ones me in my company's got, but some of the guys like Fowler, they like view, you know, the client side newer components. They're instinctively going first. Dreams are things like lists, grids still, and technique and forms, I think, are so use those in a number of, and templating, which I know places isn't particularly new. I think I've mentioned before in a webinar that Selwyn showed that, you know, this is the future. This is so powerful, and I really understand the power of client-side technology. So I didn't. We've used that technique so many times now in so client. Perhaps we'll do a webinar one of the months, and we'll show you some of the places in our applications where we've used that. What we've really come to learn, I think, is all of the newer techniques that you're coming out with, Scott, are almost all of them are side, and we've realized that for performance, that's where we've got to focus. So in fact, myself and Jack today, we were looking at a performance problem in a really busy application, hundreds of concurrent users, and users were starting to complain of a performance issue. We realized we were doing an unnecessary Ajax callback on a dropdown. We actually knew what the contents of the dropdown were without having to go back to the server and ask and have it come back. By changing that behavior to be client side, you know, we've just got rid of the performance problem. So I think what we're really trying to do now is, now we're experienced developers in the tools and the techniques, we're starting to think, right, what's the best way? There's always, I was going to say 2 ways of doing things in alpha. There's probably 22 ways of doing most things in alpha, but we're really focusing on the client side now. So we write a lot of JavaScript. We do a lot of stuff client side to keep the performance up.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think that's just about it for now. And
Cool.
Thank you so much for coming along and sharing with us these cool samples. We'd love to have you back again so soon.
No problem at all. See you next month.
All right, great. All right, so Dave should be back next week, I believe. Until then, signing off for Alpha Software. This was Scott Allen. Thanks again. See you next week.